Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of March of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates are coming from Belgorod area. The Ukrainian forces continue bombing and attacking Belgorod with multi-launch rocket systems. Mainly the Ukrainians were using for these purposes the multi-launch rocket systems of Czech Republic production by the name of Vampire. Significant number of these machines the Ukrainians used on this direction, and basically for the Russians they turned just in one thing: to hunt and to destroy as many as possible multi-launch rocket systems of the type. And according to the Ministry of Defense and according to video and footages that were published during the day, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number of these types of weapons, but from the other side we see that the Ukrainians also managed to deal significant damage. The first video we received some in the morning, that was the video from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. They published a series of attacks from the Russian side. On this, for example, period of video, we can see the Russians destroyed Patriot systems. On this part, we can see the Russians destroyed Panzerhaubitze 2000. And in the final part of the video, we can see how the Russians managed to discover the positions of Ukrainian multiple launch rocket systems Vampires of Czech Republic production, and how the Russians managed to destroy either the system and the warehouse with missiles. Furthermore, a little bit to the south, in the area of in Kharkiv area, we got in the area of Verkhnya Pisarevka, we can see another multiple launch rocket system Vampire of Czech Republic production, and we see another strike probably of Iskander or Tornado S, and another system was destroyed. A little bit to the west from this position, let's say in the area of the main clashes in the vicinity of Velika Pisarevka, we have another Iskander strike, another Ukrainian Vampire system that was bombing and attacking the Russian, let's say, civilians and towns, and in the area of Belgorod was destroyed as a result of Iskander or Tornado S strike. This is it. So that was another Vampire. So the main question, there are a few important things from all these strikes. As you can see, the Ukrainians start using the Western weapon against the Russian territory. And you know that just a few weeks ago we were talking about Piotr Pavel, the head of Czech Republic, who was talking about that NATO countries and European Union should have no red lines in the use of weapon against Russia. And basically this is the first signal that European countries sent to Putin and to Russia, that from now on, at least for Czech Republic and probably France, there are no more red lines for Ukrainians to use weapon on the territory against the territory of Russian Federation. The second thing that you may noted, that today we haven't seen any heavy clashes on the ground. There were a lot of reports about, let's say, clashes on the ground, but mainly there were reports about just multiple launch rocket system strikes on the territory of civilians, buildings, and the territory of Russian Federation. And mainly we received a lot of updates how the Russians were counterattacking and hunting those systems. What does it mean? It's a very important question. And as you can see, the Ukrainians, they promised, or at least today, the Free Russian Military Corps, the proxy Ukrainian organization, for example, today reported that at 5 p.m. they're planning to start massive attack against the positions of Russian forces in the region. And later we got a report from the Ministry of Defense. The Russians reported that at 6 p.m. they reported that they managed to discover and to destroy 15 rockets of Vampire multiple launch rocket systems in the area. So now the question, the most important question, what were the main purposes and goals of the Ukrainians to attack region, and mainly to attack Belgorod? Some of you can say that those were just acts of revenge from the Ukrainian side because they were completely defeated during the battle on the borders. Some of you can say that, tell us that very likely the Ukrainians were planning just to let's say ruin the elections, because as you know, today is the final day of elections in Russia. Tomorrow is going to be the final day, but I'll give you my opinion, and I think that this is the real reason why the Ukrainians were bombing Belgorod. The thing is that if the Ukrainians were attacking, let's say, the Russian positions with Vampire somewhere on the border, let's say the area of main clashes that took place a few days ago, very likely that the Russians wouldn't even call air defense for help. They will just send some information to the Russian soldiers forces on the ground that the Ukrainians are using, let's say, vampires. Stay be careful, and take your positions and enter these, let's say, shelters or something like this. But the Ukrainians understand this, but the Ukrainians decided to attack Belgorod just because of one reason. They wanted, first of all, to discover the Russian air defense forces. And for example, this is the video that was published not today but a few days ago. On this video we can see the work of Russian air defense, because if you attack Belgorod, if you attack civilian area, the Russians don't have any other option but to start using air defense to bring Ukrainian missiles down. They don't have any other options, and because of the use of air defense, obviously the Russians revealed all their positions, believe me. And now the Ukrainians during the day were creating a map of Russian air defense forces. The second thing, the Ukrainians overloaded the Russian air defense system, trying to understand the Russian possibilities. And the third, the Ukrainians forced the Russians to waste as many as possible missiles during this, let's say, air defense work. And tomorrow is the 17th of March, and tomorrow is the final day of elections. So very likely, after the Ukrainians managed to discover positions, to overload air defense, to force the Russians to waste missiles, tomorrow is going to be the most difficult day for Russian air defense. The Ukrainians will launch everything they have, probably and very likely, including the military package that was sent to Ukraine a few days ago by United States of America. I'll remind you that just on the 13th of March we received update that as a part of new 300 million military aid package, the United States planned, or now I believe they have already sent to Ukraine, not only ATACMS missiles with a range of 160 kilometers, but also a large batch of ammunition for HIMARS, Stinger, and so on. So very likely that tomorrow on the 17th of March we're gonna see the entire package of United States of America at work, and this is going to be disaster, and this is going to be very terrible and difficult day for the Russians. I'm not saying that Ukrainians are able to penetrate the Russian defense, because I understand the Russians know exactly for sure what the Ukrainians are planning to do. This upcoming night is going to be very difficult for the Russians. They need to restore the air defense positions, they need to change their positions, they need to bring additional missiles, and they need to get ready for the 17th of March. And obviously the Ukrainians will try to make the 17th of March the worst day for the Russians, and the Russians will try to reduce the risks from the Ukrainian side. Tomorrow is going to be hell on earth. Now we are moving further, on the ground, and let's start discussing the situation. First, let's talk about Bakhmut, Artyomov's direction. We received additional updates. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions and forces in Chasiv Yar. We have additional, let's say, videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the forest on the northeastern part of the village. And the Russians are over-concentrated in the area, and very likely the Russians are about to start the ground operation to storm Chasiv Yar. And according to the configuration and the map of Russian strikes with the different types of weapon, very likely the Russians are planning to attack Chasiv Yar along the railways from the northeastern direction. So if we return back on map, very likely the Russians are planning to attack Chasiv Yar along this line. Let me add, because the most important and the biggest number of let's say strikes took place exactly in the area. And furthermore, this is to attack along the railways is much more easier in comparison to attack Chasiv Yar through the fields. Through the fields you will always be on the under the open air, and the Russians could be destroyed just while moving, crossing the fields. But when attack through the forest, you can always be let's say invisible for Ukrainian artillery or many other types of weapon. Also, we haven't received anything about Ivanovska, but as we discussed in the previous update, during the previous 24 hours the Russians conducted a very powerful full-scale offensive operation using significant number of armored vehicles. Up to 10 armored vehicles, tank, personnel carriers were involved in that attack. The video was provided by the AT's Air Mobile Brigade of Armored Forces of Ukraine. On this video we can see a few episodes of how the Ukrainians were trying to repel and to stop and to slow down the Russian offensive. Currently, we can't tell for sure whether the Ukrainians were successful or not, but according to some episodes, we see that the Russians lost some armored vehicles and tanks. But the important thing is that this video with Russian attempt to attack from Bakhmut towards the northern part of Klishchiivka, this direction, were published almost at the same time when some Western mappers have updated their maps to the south of Ivanovska. Maybe these two events are connected, and maybe the Russians, as a result of attack, managed to establish control over the territory. So we'll see. Obviously, within the next few days, we're going to receive more details and updates. Now we are moving to Donetsk, Avdiivka directions. We have lots of very interesting details and updates. So let's start from the northern part, from Berdichi. The Ukrainians still haven't managed to force the Russians to fall back from these intersections. The Russians continue holding the area. They have additional support from Russian artillery, FPV drone strikes, so they managed to dig in deeper. And this is a very big problem for the Ukrainians, because now they need to find a solution how to save their forces and how to withdraw and retreat towards the next defense belt. From the other side, we continue receiving reports from different pro-Ukrainian mappers that the Russians managed to advance, and according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, this is approximately the Russian control in the area as a result of clashes and Russian assault operations that were conducted during the previous 24 or 48 hours. So the Russians are shortening their line of combat contact, which allows them to reduce additional forces, to release additional resources, and to use them on other directions. When talking about Orlovka, according to different mappers, this is approximately the current Russian control in the area. So as you can see, the Russians also managed to reach the Tonenka as close as possible, and very likely the next 48 hours the Russians will make more attempts to attack the territory. Furthermore, this morning we got another video how the Russians were moving along these trenches and how they managed to bypass the farms from the south and to enter the trenches. The Ukrainians tried to slow down the Russians with FPV drone strikes, but as we can see, the Ukrainians haven't managed to achieve any results, and basically the Russians managed to come to area, to land the infantry, and to capture the trenches. So very likely within the next 48 hours the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back from the farms and from this part of Tonenka as well, and the Russians will reach the operational space. Interesting details are coming from the area between Novokalinovo and Krasnogorovka, and furthermore, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation also noted and pointed our attention to the area. The Russians reported that they managed to deal significant damage to the Ukrainians in this area. Also, the Russians managed to repel few Ukrainian counterattacks. On the previous video, we could see the Russian artillery strikes. On this video we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions with Salt flamethrower systems. So very heavy weapon the Russians were using, as you can see. And on this video we can see let's say failed attempt from the Ukrainian side to counter-attack the Russian positions with the purpose to clear the trenches. But the Ukrainians managed to reach the tree line with possible Russian soldiers to the right. As you can see, this is the Russian soldiers are waiting for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians entered the territory, landed the infantry, but during the landing process the Russians destroyed them with a mortar strike, and that attack was repelled. Anyway, we see that the Russians are pretty concentrated in this area, which confirms that either the Russians are planning to, or either the Ukrainians are planning to attack the Russians, or the Russians are planning to continue offensive operation further to Ocheretina and to Novokalinovo. But when talking about the situation on the ground, due to the fact that the Russians are about to finish the battle for this defense belt, very likely the Russians can start offensive to Novokalinovo with the purpose to establish control over Ocheretina. Now we are moving further. We got today the official, let's say, video from the Russian sources, from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, of battle for Nivoyska. They published the video. If you have access to map, the video is very long, 5 minutes. This video describes the process of storming and so on. So we have not just the report of the Ministry of Defense, but also we have a real footage showing the Russian control over the territory. We haven't received for probably second, the third day in a row any updates from Krasnogorovka, Georgievka, Pobeda, Maximilianovka. Very likely the Russians are regrouping after very heavy clashes in the area. After probably a week of regrouping, they will restart and renew their offensive. Novomikhailivka, we got additional update from the sources on the ground. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the area of farms for additional kilometer. So basically, if we use the information from the sources on the ground, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the farms by the evening of the 16th of March. Very likely within the next few days we're going to receive a final confirmation of this. If it's true, then we can say that Ukrainians completely left the eastern part, and now the main clashes are taking place in the central part and in the western part. The Russians are bombing and attacking the Ukrainians already in the central part and on the southern streets, so very likely the Ukrainians soon will be forced to leave Novomikhailivka completely. No updates from Ugledar direction, no updates from Velika Novoselovka. The only important thing I would like to pay your attention is that the Russians increase the activity of aviation direction. They continue bombing and attacking the area with FAB 500, FAB 1500, and for example, today we got additional video of this. But if we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of months, we see the Russian activity, aviation activity, to the east and southeast of Norozhaina and to the west of Staromayorska, which also confirms that very likely the Russians have some plans for further offensive. Now we are moving to Zaporozhye direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operations, and now we have discovered the first Ukrainian more or less reliable base in the area that Ukrainians are trying to fight for, and this is the territory I'm talking about. So currently this is the main stronghold of armed forces of Ukraine on Rabotina-Verbova direction, and this is their main base. The fall of the base of this area will lead to complete collapse of defense belt on this direction. Now the Russians during the previous days maybe made few attempts to attack the area in front, but very likely most of those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians. So that's why the Russians decided to bypass this stronghold from the north and from the south. And during the previous few days we saw a lot of geolocations and videos of how the Russians were attacking using this road. We were changing the map almost every single day when received additional update, and today we got another change and another Ukrainian video of how they were trying to stop the Russians with FPV drones. The Ukrainians were bombing them here, and a source reported about additional progress deep inside of the territory for another kilometer. Very difficult to understand how exactly those clashes ended from the Russian side and from the Ukrainian, but we have a video how the Ukrainians captured another Russian soldier who surrendered, and they basically captured him and they brought him to this base. About Rabotina report, the sources are saying that the Russians have complete control over the central and the southern part. They control half of the village. No reports about the northern and northeastern part. So the clashes for Rabotina is coming to an end. Obviously 2 or maximum 3 weeks, and the Ukrainians and the, let's say, defense belt and the line of combat contact will go along this line. So 2-3 weeks, I think so, not longer. When talking about Odessa direction, we have additional reports of the Russian strike that was successfully conducted by the Russians on the 15th of March. We have a lot of analysis. Once again, I'll remind you that the Russians managed to destroy the meeting. They attacked the meeting. There were a lot of high-ranked officers in that meeting, the heads of, let's say, Loot Offense, Storm Brigade, and Tsunami Storm Brigade, and furthermore today we start receiving updates that also on that meeting there were lots of NATO officers. For example, the sources reported that with this paragraph, in addition, we managed to find out the names of some liquidated foreigners: Klaus Fischer, Germany; Jürgen Schmidt, Germany; Kevin Miller, United States of America; Philip LeBlanc, France; Stefan Dragomir, Romania. What positions they held and what structures they belonged to establish does not seem possible. The presence of foreigners and the topic of the meeting will be discussed with us later. So we start receiving the first evidence that there were lots of, let's say, volunteers and probably NATO officers. Some sources are saying that up to 60 NATO officers were buried under the ruins of strikes. There were lots of, let's say, reports that NATO aviation started evacuating of those who managed to survive. And if you remember, Zelensky himself called this attack very, very he used a very bad Russian word describing that attack on Russia themselves. And what was the bad, according to Zelensky, from the situation is that the Russians made the first strike and they managed to bury under the ruins significant number of NATO officers and Ukrainian officers. Then the evacuation and evacuation and ambulance teams arrived on the area trying to rescue those who managed to survive. And then the Russians made the second strike and they basically destroyed the evacuation team as well. So that was why Zelensky was so upset and telling so bad words about those Russian strikes. So obviously the next few days we're going to receive more numbers about the results about those attacks. And that's it. So the 16th of March is about to be finished. Probably today we're going to receive more updates. You're going to see them. And tomorrow is the 17th of March and something big is going to happen, because before the 17th of March, the president of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, had a telephone conversation with the president of Belarus, Lukashenko. Maybe they were discussing some plans, because if Ukraine crossed the red line and deal massive damage to Belgorod and civilians, I think that Putin will not have any other option but maybe even to declare war. Who knows? And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.